Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing great. We did Russia a second ago when it comes to like the video itself, the history of Russia, and I was very curious about Seward's Folly. I was very curious about Alaska. Um, really, why did they sell it? What happened? Etc. Etc. Let's jump right in. Premodernist, we love that.
In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia. And the way this is remembered in American culture is that it's often perceived as Seward's Folly, that there was no economic benefit seen at the time for it. It just seemed like an Arctic wasteland. And then it was only decades later that the purchase was vindicated when gold and oil was discovered there. But in fact, that's not true. Many people at the time, in 1867, saw a lot of value in Alaska. And
Yeah, that's like 20, 30 years after like the original, maybe even longer, the original Californian gold rushes, and there's been mines throughout history. I can imagine that there was definitely some like speculation, but there had to have been experts that surveyed this area.
approved of the purchase. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today in this video. The U.S. arrived for good on the Pacific coast in the 1840s. In 1846, they resolved their territorial dispute with Great Britain in the Oregon Country. And then in 1848, they resolved their conquest of northern Mexico and made California American territory. And so they were on the Pacific, and they weren't done expanding. They wanted to expand some more. So there had been talk and rumors of the U.S. acquiring Alaska going back to the 1850s. And there was a lot of positive buzz in the U.S. media about that. In
The media, the newspapers.
December of 1866, the Tsar of Russia decided he would go ahead and sell Alaska to the U.S. So during mid to late March, Secretary of State Seward and Minister de Stuckel had a series of negotiations where they worked on the price and various details of the treaty. And then they signed the treaty in the early morning hours of Friday, March 30th, 1867. Then it went to the Senate. The Senate held a special
The refrigerator in the Capitol appeared at the time. Wow, it looks brand new.
session, and they ratified the treaty on April 9th of 1867, and then it went to the president's desk and he signed it into law. And so during April of 1867, there's a lot of reporting in the newspapers about this deal. Some of the reporting was quite negative, but that negative reporting had basically one of two angles. Either it was saying that Alaska has no economic value, that it's just a wasteland, and or it was saying Andrew Johnson is a terrible president. Anything that he proposes is going to be bad, and so we're opposed to it because we hate Andrew Johnson. There was some of that going on.
I mean, think about 1867. You're a few years after the Civil War. That's 2 years after the Civil War. Scrutiny is probably going to be at an all-time high with anything federally. So it's interesting.
But most of the newspapers at the time were quite
Let me read this. Let me see if he's going to read it first.
positive toward the deal, and also most members of Congress were in favor
Oh, he did not read it. The announcement of the negotiation of a treaty between the United States and Russia, by which the latter cedes all of her American possessions to the United States, will be held with pleasure by the whole American people, and I will give new vigor to the friendship which has hit here. I'm so smart. There's a better way to pronounce that. Made the two nations allies under all circumstances. The United States have never had a friend among the nations of Europe, save Russia. In peace and in war, in prosperity and distress, Russia has confronted the nations of the world as the devoted friend of the United States. That friendship she has made practical by her magnificent cession of her vast American domain to the American Union.
were quite positive toward the deal. And also, most members of Congress were in favor of the deal. It passed the Senate. The Senate had to ratify the treaty by a 2/3 majority, which it succeeded to do. So, I mean, that would not have been the case if this had just been Secretary of State Seward with his own pet project of acquiring an icebox in the Arctic and that no one else recognized the value of. If that were the case, it would not have passed the Senate. The fact that it got 2/3 of the Senate to vote for it, and the fact that most of the newspapers at the time were reporting positively about it, suggests that
So it didn't even seem like much people cared, like in the Senate.
there was actually a lot of public opinion support for it. And the support for acquiring Alaska among the Americans was based on three main reasons. The first reason was natural resources in Alaska.
I mean, we have like a parallel with Greenland right now. Obviously, Greenland's not ours to claim by no means, but these are similar arguments.
There were natural resources that were known and were already being exploited. There were a lot of very rich fishing areas off the coast of Alaska, and Americans were already heavily involved in fishing and whaling in the North Pacific. The U.S. was at the forefront of whaling in the 19th century, and many American ships went whaling not just in the Gulf of Alaska, but in Russian waters, in the Sea of Okhotsk.
I believe it.
Hundreds of American whaling ships would go there every year. So the North Pacific was already an area where there was a lot of American commercial interest. And so Alaska was seen as an extension of that. The Americans would have free rein to fish and whale in Alaskan waters. They wouldn't have to negotiate a lease with the Russian American company. They could just go and do it. There were furs in Alaska that were still actively being harvested. There was also opportunities for timber. There wasn't a lot of timber harvesting at this point in Alaska. There was
Right, because you need on ground for that. You need trains for that, or ship ports for that.
a little bit, but it had a very specialized purpose. But that brings me to another natural resource that Alaska had, which is ice. Now, it's kind of a stereotype. Oh, it was ice. It was Seward's ice box. It was Seward's Folly. He just acquired a bunch of ice in the Arctic. But acquiring ice was actually a business in the 1800s.
That's true for meat and storage.
Electrically powered refrigeration did not become a thing until the turn of the 20th century, and then did not become widely available as a consumer product until the 1920s, with refrigerators that you could put in your home, that you could plug in.
Some late adopters did not wait till... Wow, that's crazy.
Prior to that time, people kept their food cold with ice boxes, which was this wood cabinet with a drawer. You put a block of ice in the drawer, and then that would keep your food cool during the day. And
We have it so good.
then every day you'd swap out the ice. And you would buy a subscription service where ice would be delivered to your door every morning, but it was not available on the West Coast. And actually, some ice was available on the West Coast, but if you were in California and you wanted ice, it was really expensive because that ice was shipped down the east coast of North America and South America, around Cape Horn, up along the west coast of South America,
Oh my goodness. This shows you how important the Panama Canal really is.
coast of North America, all the way to California. And because of the long shipping route, the ice was really expensive. And so a company was formed in San Francisco around 1850 called the American-Russian Commercial Company that acquired a lease from the Russians to go up and they would cut ice in Alaska and then ship it, or Russian America as it was known at the time, and then ship it down to California for the California market. Now, ice was not in itself a major industry. This was not a major consideration for the Americans, but it just...
Icing on the cake.
It's a further evidence of the multiple ways that Alaska was economically useful to the Americans even in the 1860s. Now, about that timber stuff. So there was no timber industry at the time in Alaska, but there was a lot of potential for one that was recognized by Americans, especially businessmen on the West Coast. But some trees were being harvested, but they were being harvested for the specialized purpose of insulating the ice.
I gotta remember, what is a lithograph? Hold on. ChatGPT time. ChatGPT time. ChatGPT time. A lithograph is a print used Oh, okay. Okay. Gotcha. It's just a print. Gotcha.
Ice for shipment. When ice was cut and shipped hundreds of miles to customers in the United States, the main way of insulating the ice was with sawdust. So in the case of Alaska, they were producing their ice at Kodiak, and then they also established a sawmill at Kodiak to make sawdust to insulate the ice. And lastly, and probably most importantly, there was a widespread recognition that there were bound to be vast mineral resources in Alaska. And here's where kind of the pop culture version of the Alaska Purchase is a little bit misleading, because there's this idea that, nobody knew that Alaska had this economic potential, and then Russia sold Alaska to the U.S. thinking it was economically worthless, and then they discovered gold, and then
Yeah, my question isn't as much why did the United States purchase, is why did Russia give it up?
And they discovered oil. But actually, it was well known, it was established while it was still Russian territory that there were bound to be massive deposits of various minerals. Geologists had done surveys. They had determined that this was likely to be an area with gold. In fact, in the 1850s, a rumor started going around that gold had been discovered in the Alaska Panhandle. And this scared the Russian authorities because if there was actually gold in Alaska, then a bunch of Americans would rush up there to get the gold, and the Russian authorities would not be able to control them or prevent them from entering the territory. So the Russians knew that there was likely to be gold there. That concerned them, that worried them. And again, I'm not going to talk about the Russian side of this in this video. I'm not going to talk about the Russian motivations for selling Alaska.
That's the whole point I wanted to know.
I'll save that for another video.
I can't wait. Let me know.
But from the American perspective, they knew there was going to be mineral riches in Alaska, and that was a major motivator for acquiring it. So that's natural resources for Alaska itself. But Alaska also had other purposes beyond just the natural resources. So that brings me to the second reason for the U.S. acquiring Alaska, which was that it would make it easier for the U.S. to exploit the Asian market.
Yeah?
Now, American merchants have been traveling to Asia since colonial times, and China was seen as an enormous potential market. And so it was believed in 1867 that Alaska would make that easier. Now, for example, at the time, ships ran on coal, and ships that ran on coal would need to stop periodically to refuel their coal. And so coaling stations were dotted around the world at various ports all over the world that ships
like pit stops
would stop out to restock their coal supply. And so one of the considerations that Americans had was that they could use the Aleutian Islands as coaling stations for their merchant ships sailing to China. And it was also believed in kind of a more general sense that Alaska was well positioned because if you look at a globe and you look at where Alaska is compared to the US and China, it's kind of almost in the middle between the two. So it's bound to help. You'd have port cities along the way. If American ships get into trouble, they need to stop. There are friendly ports there.
I mean, this is also a really good reason of why we have Hawaii.
There are resupply ports. There was even one newspaper that talked about how someday Sitka, which was the main town in Alaska at the time, someday Sitka is going to be as big as San Francisco. Now, that prediction didn't pan out, obviously, but that's just one example of the boosterism that was going on about, the economic potential that Alaska has that'll help us to exploit the Asian trade. And just in general, there was an attitude among Americans that Alaska was going to help America become the preeminent power in the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific was seen by many Americans as the next frontier, the next area of American expansion.
I mean, it really was. I mean, some of this was required in the Spanish-American War, obviously, but it really was.
On from the North American continent, extending out into the Pacific Ocean. They had already begun acquiring islands there. Midway Island was acquired in the 1850s, I believe. And then there was talk in the mid-19th century of acquiring Hawaii, which ended up happening many decades later in 1898. The interest that American businesses had in
we did a lot in 1898.
Doing business with Asia prompted the American government in the early 1850s to send a warship to Japan and force the Japanese government to open up its ports to American business.
Yeah, we didn't really like isolationists.
And so Alaska fit into this wider picture of American activity in the Pacific Ocean. So looked at from the perspective of American interest in the Pacific, Alaska makes a lot of sense in terms of strategic positioning. Now, speaking of strategic positioning, that brings me to the third reason for American interest in Alaska. So I've talked about the natural resources in Alaska, and I've talked about the strategic advantage it would give America in its commercial expansion into the Pacific and toward Asia. And then the third reason that America had for acquiring Alaska was that it would further the goal that many Americans had of acquiring the British colonies to the north of the United States, what we now call Canada.
So we actually wanted to acquire Canada within Manifest Destiny. I didn't know that.
Now, we have to be careful not to misconstrue what that meant at the time. Looking at it from our perspective in the 21st century, we think, the U.S. was going to invade Canada, which is this country that exists up there. Why would they do that? Why don't they just respect Canada's existence? But Canada, as we know it, did not exist in March and April of 1867. What we now call Canada was, at the time, 9 different British colonies, most of which had completely separate existence from each other. They had their own relationship with the crown, distinct from everyone else's, and there was no common identity among them. And so the U.S. interest in acquiring what we now call Canada, it was not to acquire the country of Canada. It was to acquire these little different piecemeal
It was to basically be in competition with some of these Northwest lands.
colonies that were scattered across the North American continent. And from the American perspective, this was to complete the task that had been begun in 1776. Because when the British colonies rebelled from British rule in 1775-76, we talk about the 13 colonies, but there were more than 13 colonies at the time. There were other colonies that didn't join in. Quebec and Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. They didn't join the rebellion. And there was an expectation among Americans that later on they'll join up. And this was not an unprecedented idea. For example, the British had colonies. The colonies of East Florida and West Florida were British colonies for a while, until the British ceded them to Spain, and then the U.S. acquired them from Spain. So those were British colonies at the time of the American Revolution that later were incorporated into the United States. And so many Americans in the 19th century believed that it was America's destiny to spread across the entire continent. When Americans talked about manifest destiny at the time, they weren't just talking about spreading westward and acquiring the middle tier, the middle third of the North American continent that we have now. They didn't know what we know. We know today that the U.S. ended up acquiring this middle band of North American territory. But in the early and mid-19th century, Americans didn't know that that's what was going to happen. And so when they talked about America spreading across the continent, they meant the whole continent, including what we now call Canada. And so many in 1867 thought that by acquiring Alaska, that would make it easier for the Americans to acquire the British colonies to the north of the U.S. and to the east of Alaska. Most notably British Columbia, which was located in between Alaska and the mainland of the U.S. And in fact, there was a lot of interest in British Columbia in joining the United States.
Wow.
This was in 1867. A few years before this, British Columbia was formed by a merger of 2 different colonies. The colony of British Columbia, which was on the mainland, and then the colony of Vancouver Island. And Vancouver Island, there had actually been a really strong movement of pro-annexation, join the U.S. and become an American state. And in fact, it was this American interest in moving northward and annexing the colonies of British North America that was the main impetus to the creation of the Confederation of Canada. Both of those things happened in 1867.
It was a preemptive measure.
Both the Alaska Purchase and the Confederation of Canada. So in March of 1867, the treaty was negotiated between Seward and de Stuckel. And then in April of 1867, the U.S. Senate ratified the treaty. And then a couple months later, on July 1st, Confederation went into effect when 3 of the 9 British colonies confederated into the Dominion of Canada. And then in October of 1867, the formal transfer took place at Sitka between Russian and American officials. That's when Alaska officially became American territory. Now, if you've made it this far in the video, you were probably really into the Alaska Purchase. And so I'm going to end on a little tidbit that's going to be of interest to hardcore Alaska Purchase fans, which is, why was the purchase price $7.2 million? Why wasn't it a round number like $7 million?
Currency?
The reason for this is a little arcane, but if you've got this far in the video, you're probably really into this stuff. So let me explain. So $7 million was actually the price they negotiated. When they went into the negotiation, actually the price, the way they went up and down, the number that had been floated around a lot had been $5 million. That was the number that had been floated back in 1859. By 1866, when the Tsar said, let's go ahead and sell Alaska to the Americans, he said, don't sell it for $5 million, go higher. So when they negotiated the deal in March of 1867, the number that they arrived at was $7 million. But there was one outstanding issue in the negotiations, which is what to do about the leases. And I mentioned earlier about the ice company that was supplying ice to San
Oh, so these are like the companies.
Francisco, the American-Russian commercial company. They had a lease from the Russians.
They bought out the lease
to run their ice production facility at Kodiak. And William Seward was insistent that the U.S. not be required to honor any pre-existing leases. And it was going to be written right into the treaty, no leases are going to be honored. And the Russians were like, well, we have this lease with them. What are we going to do about that? And there were some other kind of minor issues about what to do with some of the buildings that were located in Alaska. So Seward offered, okay, because of that pre-existing lease that's going to be terminated, and because of a few more minor issues, I'll go ahead and tack on an extra $200,000.
Interesting.
So that's where that $7.2 million comes from. So anyway, if you
That's awesome. Well, we still don't know why did Russia sell it. Let me know down below, guys. This was fun. Yeah, we got to do more Premodernist videos because they're just so awesome. They're so awesome. Appreciate you guys so much. Consider subscribing. Until next time, peace out. Bye-bye.